Well, if y'all know anything about me, you know I love stories. I love telling stories. I love being told stories. If you've ever spent a dinner with my wife, Lindsay, and I, you know that essentially our entire conversation is just stories. Sometimes we can overwhelm people by the amount of stories that we tell. This is because I come from a storytelling family. I have loads and loads of memories of sitting around a dinner table after school, and either my mother or my father would always say to my brother and my sister and I, tell us something about your day. And it wasn't an option. We had to tell a story about that day. I have memories of holiday dinners of Thanksgiving and Christmas where my uncle, who has literally written volumes of books about our family, they've never been published, but he has written volumes of books of our family stories. And there are times at the Thanksgiving dinner table where something would happen and he would reach into his coat pocket and pull out a pen and start to jot down notes on a notepad of things that he was going to later write and put into these books. I have an aunt who is one of the most southern, sweet ladies you could ever meet in your life. And at every Thanksgiving and at every Christmas, she would start to unwind a beautiful tale and a story that was filled with mystery and humor. And it was always, of course, based on some actual event. And she would tell these long, winding stories, and it never failed. Every story that she told would end with like one sentence that would just give the whole story meaning, and then it would conclude everything that happened in the story. And she would always do it by laying her hands on the dining room table and throwing her head back and saying, "Well, to make a long story short." And that's when you knew, like, the conclusion was here. And of course, it was never a short story. It was always a long story. But I've always been really interested and intrigued by ideas of stories that you get to enter into a world and into the mindset of a character for a moment in time, and maybe you learn something about that moment in time or learn something about yourself. So when I went off to college, I entered the mass media program down at Valdosta State University. And we started to learn about what it meant to make a good story, how to make a good story. Then I started to realize at a very early age, I started to pick up on stories that I really liked. And they often came in the form of movies. I love movies. My entire family loves movies. And that's kind of we have our hooks in that kind of storytelling. I remember watching The Lion King thousands of times as a child, of this story of this boy, this lion boy, who felt somehow responsible in his father's death, so he runs away. He has to kind of figure out who he is, and then he has to return and defeat, the evil Scar, who is going to attack his family. My entire family is also obsessed with the Batman stories. Now I'm telling you, whether it's the comic books, or if it's the cartoons, or if the movies, which have been pretty good recently, that story about a young man who went through a traumatizing experience but uses that awful experience to work good for his city is just something that really excites me. Jurassic Park was one of the big version storytellings that I remember as a kid. But I tell you, no story has had a bigger impact on me and really on my marriage than the story of Dumb and Dumber. That's as good as it gets. Dumb and Dumber is one of the best stories ever told. But let's get back to the point. So I went down to Valdosta State University and we started to learn about what makes these movies, because it was a video degree, a narrative video degree. What makes these movies so good? And there's really four key things that are really fundamental building blocks of what makes a story good. The first of which is a good story has a clear beginning, it has a clear middle, and it has a clear end. But if you want to make a story even better than that, you need to have a story that has a beginning, middle, and end, and a main character that has an arc. That character, by the end of the story, should be different than how he or she was at the beginning of the story. The events have changed that person. They've learned something new about the world or something new about themselves. Now, if you want to make an even better story than that, you need to have a clear beginning, middle, and end, a character who has an arc, and the audience should experience an arc. And you know this if you've ever listened to a song that tells a story, or read a good book, or left a movie theater knowing that you're a little bit different. That something inside of you has changed. Either you have a new perspective on yourself, or maybe on the world. That's really, truly good storytelling. But even better than that, if you can have a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, and a character who goes through an arc, and an audience that has a cathartic experience, if you can do all that and have a surprise ending, then you've really told the best story that you can tell. I don't know if you've ever seen a movie called The Prestige. It's made by the guy who's been making the Batman movies recently, a guy named Christopher Nolan. I often describe the movie The Prestige as one of the best boring movies ever made. It's extremely complicated. There's loads of talking. It's essentially about two magicians who are rivals, and their rivalry gets so intense that it becomes violent. The movie's about 2 hours long, and you get to the very last scene. And for those of you who've seen this movie, you know what I'm talking about. You watch the last scene, and then it cuts to black, and you realize what happens in this last scene changes everything that I just saw. And immediately you think, I hope I have 2 more hours because I need to play this again from the beginning, because this scene has changed everything. And that's what takes that from being a boring story, yes, but a great story. It's important that we look through the endings of stories. If you stop halfway through a story, you put yourself in a situation where you don't understand what the point of the story is. If you stop halfway through The Lion King, it's about a boy who thinks that he's responsible for his father's death. Stop halfway through Batman, it's about a guy who falls into depression because of traumatic experience. If you stop halfway through Dumb and Dumber, that's okay, because it's still an awesome movie. You will enjoy Dumb and Dumber no matter how much you do or do not watch that movie. But the story that we're going to look at today is one that I think fills the qualifications of what makes a great story. It has a clear beginning, a middle, and end. Multiple characters go through arcs. The audience will be affected by what happens, and the ending of the story has a huge impact on the entire thing. And that's the book of Jonah. Jonah is a great example of a concise, well-put-together story. Now, when I say the book of Jonah, most people think of Jonah and what?
The whale.
And the whale, right? Which is an important part of the story of Jonah. But that is in the second chapter of a 4-chapter story of Jonah. And Jonah tells us so much more about who we are as disciples of God and who God is and how He works in the world. So, in this story, we're going to spend most of today in chapter 3. We're going to look a little bit at chapter 4. But before we get into chapter 3, I feel like I should catch you up on the story of Jonah. What happens before chapter 3, where we're going to settle into? So the first 2 chapters of Jonah describe Jonah, who is an Israelite and a prophet of God. His role in life is to receive a word from God and then give it to the people. So at the very beginning of Jonah chapter 1, God speaks to Jonah and He says, go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to them that in 40 days their city will be destroyed. They've become so wicked that I'm going to destroy their city. So Jonah, being a prophet of God, an Israelite prophet of God, what does he do? He gets on a ship, but instead of heading to Nineveh, he heads to a town or city named Tarshish. Now what's interesting about Tarshish is not only is it in the exact opposite direction of Nineveh, it's a long journey in the opposite direction of Nineveh. Now, that may seem a little strange, but we'll get back to that. So Jonah is on the ship, and a horrible storm happens. The storm is so bad that the crew members know that if the storm doesn't stop, the ship is probably going to sink. And they start praying to as many gods as they can think of, hoping that they can appease and somehow satisfy whatever God is creating this terrible storm. Well, eventually, Jonah speaks up and says, guys, I think this is because of me. You see, I'm a prophet of the Lord Almighty. I'm a prophet of the God of Israel. And He told me to go to Tarshish. He told me to go to Nineveh. And here I boarded a ship for Tarshish. And I think if you throw me off of this ship, I think the storm will stop, because I think the storm is about me. So after some deliberation, the crew of the ship decided to throw Jonah off. And it stops the storm. And that's where we pick up in chapter 2, where God sends a great fish, a whale, to swallow up Jonah. And inside the whale, Jonah does exactly what all of us would do if we were trapped inside of a whale. He says this beautiful prayer to God. And essentially, you can read this in chapter 2. This is the James Savage paraphrase. But it's essentially Jonah saying, God, you are awesome. I am bad. You are big. I am small. You smell wonderful. I smell like the inside of a fish. And I promise I'll do anything. I'll go to Nineveh. Just get me out of this fish. So God has the fish spit up Jonah on dry land. And that's where we pick up in chapter 3. Before we read it, I think there's 2 interesting questions that are fair to ask. When you read the first 2 chapters, you could ask, why is God so concerned with destroying an entire city? And secondly, why, if Jonah is a prophet of God, why would he, for this one case, not only not do what God has called him to, but do the exact opposite that God has called him to? Well, those 2 questions can be answered with one date. And that date is 722 BC. You see, in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire, which was known for conquering much of the ancient Near East, conquered Israel. But when the Assyrians conquer someone, they don't just take over a place and start running their government. The Assyrians were not only very, very good at violence, they celebrated their violence. They would flog and skin people in open forum so that all of those who were being spared would see this violence and know the Assyrians have come here, fear the Assyrians. When you would walk into a city that the Assyrians are conquered, you would see people on pikes, impaled on pikes in front of the city. So if anybody walking up to the city would know, the Assyrians have been here. Fear the Assyrians. They would take the leaders and the wealthy and those who had influence in the cities that they would conquer, and they would deport them to surrounding territories that the Assyrians had conquered so that there would be no uprising of leadership. And if leadership looked like was ever starting to happen in any of the places that they conquered, they would immediately either kill those people or deport them. They would also enslave the people that they had conquered. There are carvings and reliefs of people being marched out of their city in slavery, in chains, being forced to sing and clap in humiliation by the people that had just conquered them. The Assyrians were the last people on earth you'd want to mess with. And in 722, they conquered Israel. But why is that important? Well, Nineveh was the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The book of Jonah was written in the mid-500s BC. So it was written about 200 years after the Assyrians conquered Israel. So when God calls to Jonah, go to Nineveh, Jonah knows that God is calling him to one of the most violent places that he could go, and going to the place of the people, the capital of the people who murdered his ancestors 200 years ago. So Jonah gets on a ship and goes as far the other direction as he can. But we pick up in chapter 3 after the ship incident, after the whale incident, and Jonah finally has decided to do what God has said, and he steps into Nineveh. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 3, we read, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I will tell you." So Jonah set out and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly large city, a 3 days' walk across. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's walk. I imagine terrified of what was going to happen next. And he cried out, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Now Jonah is an Israelite in a foreign land, in an Assyrian land, saying that the God of the Israelites is going to destroy this city. I can imagine Jonah's clothing soaked with sweat. I can imagine his hands shaking as he says his proclamation, wondering where the first attack is going to come from. Where the first arrow or the first spear or the first sword is going to come from these people. But it doesn't happen. In verse 4, Jonah makes his proclamation, and in verse 5 we read, "And the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast, and everyone great and small put on sackcloth." A fast and a sackcloth is a tangible way of showing humility and repentance. In verse 6 we read, "When the news reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself in sackcloth, and sat in ashes," which is an even more tangible way of showing repentance and humility. Then he had a proclamation made in Nineveh, which said, "The decree of the king and his nobles, no man, being or animal, no herd or flock shall taste anything. They shall not feed, nor shall they drink water. Human beings and animals shall be covered with sackcloth, and they shall cry mightily to God. all shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hands. Who knows? God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish. Here comes the ending that I think is so important. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind about the calamity that he had said he would bring upon them. And he did not do it. Friends, our God is a redeeming God who calls his people to be redeeming people. This is something that Jonah missed. Jonah, who should know, who's a prophet of God, missed the fact that God is a redeeming God who calls his people to be redeeming people. Jonah worked out of fear and out of anger. When we read into chapter 4, we find out, we have confirmed Jonah's true motivation for fleeing from God. Standing in Nineveh, the attack that he thought may happen didn't come. So he walks out of Nineveh and he climbs a hill so where he can look down on Nineveh. He sits there and he waits, hoping to see the lightning or the fire from the sky or the earthquake or the earth swallow up Nineveh. He looks to see in his eyes what is justice. Those who destroyed Israel are now going to be destroyed. He looks to see the pain that his ancestors and his families continue to experience. He looks to see that pain enacted on Nineveh. But it doesn't happen. So finally, Jonah has a conversation with God, and in verse 2 he says, he prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is this not what I said while I was still in my own country? That this is why I fled to Tarshish at the beginning, for I knew that you were a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing. And now, Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live." Jonah finally says it. I didn't want to come here because I knew that if I came here and gave them the opportunity to be forgiven, then they might seek repentance. And if they seek repentance, then you would forgive them. And God, I don't want that. I don't want them to be forgiven. So Jonah continues to sit and wait. And it's extremely hot. So God grows a bush to shade Jonah. And for a day it shades him. And he sits there waiting for the destruction to happen. Overnight, a worm destroys the bush. And the next day, Jonah keeps on saying this phrase, "I'm so angry, I'm angry enough to die." It's one of those situations where you're already upset about something. So then no matter what happens next, it already makes you that much more upset. I mean, it's just a bush. But Jonah is so frustrated with the fact that he came all of this way for nothing to happen, that now that the bush is gone, Jonah says, "I'm so frustrated I could die." So God finally has a talk with Jonah. At the very end of the book, this is how Jonah chapter 4 ends. God confronts Jonah, and it says in verse 9 of chapter 4, "But God said to Jonah, 'Is it right for you to be angry about the bush?' And he said, 'Yes, angry enough to die.' And the Lord said, 'You're concerned about the bush, for which you did not labor, which you did not grow. It came into being in a night, and it perished in a night. And should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also many animals?'" In verse 11, God says, should I not be concerned for Nineveh? And he says there's 120,000 persons. He doesn't say Assyrians. He doesn't say Ninevites. God doesn't say men, women, or children. He doesn't say sinners. He says in Nineveh there are 120,000 persons. Jonah and Nineveh could not be more separate from each other. Jonah is an Israelite. He's a prophet of the God of Israel. And Nineveh is the capital of the empire that destroyed Israel. They share something in common. They both needed a wake-up call. Jonah stood inside Nineveh, and after his first proclamation, Nineveh said that they believed God and that they would have a fast and put on sackcloth and stop doing the violence that they were known for. Maybe Nineveh knew what they were doing was wrong. Maybe they knew that all they needed was someone to just stand up and say, what you're doing is wrong. They needed a wake-up call. They needed to know that God was a redeeming God. But Jonah needed a wake-up call too. Jonah was inside the fold of Israel. He was a high-seen character. But Jonah needed a wake-up call to know that God is a redeeming God, and he calls his people to be a redeeming people. That his grudge against the Assyrians or the Ninevites was not going to stand. That God was not concerned with punishing the Ninevites, but redeeming the Ninevites. I don't know where our collective situations lie. Whether we identify more with Jonah, if we identify more with the Israelites, or somewhere in between. But sometimes in our life, we need wake-up calls. Sometimes in our life, we know what we're doing is wrong. And sometimes I wish someone would just say it. That's the motivation I need. Sometimes we need to know that the faith that we hold on to is not for us to keep to ourselves. And although there is pain in the world that sometimes we have caused and pain that others have caused on us, but the story of Jonah tells us that it's not our pain to hold on to. Because God is a redeeming God who calls his people to be redeeming people, even in the worst circumstances. And what's great is through this, we realize that we fall into the category of having a good story. We have a beginning and a middle and an end because our walk with Jesus isn't a moment. It's a journey where we experience different seasons. In our life, we're going to have an arc. Hopefully, today, you are not the person you were yesterday. And tomorrow, you're not going to be the person that you are today. And I promise those who see your life are going to be affected by what they see in your life. And the surprise ending for us is no surprise at all. It's that we're not defined by being a prophet or being a Ninevite. We're not defined by the good things that we did yesterday or the mistakes that we're going to make tomorrow. We're defined by the fact that God is a redeeming God, and he calls his people to be redeeming people.